Hello, everybody. You can't see us, but I would just like to tell you that we are Jane is a very attractive brunette. I'm a very attractive blonde in our early 30s. Okay, not true. The advantage of webinar.
Hello, I'm Jane Ellison, and we're going to say a little bit about who we are and then move right into talking about how the ACEs study informs home visiting. My background is that I am a marriage and family therapy, licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am an infant and early childhood mental health specialist. In my job, I do a number of different things, including some private practice where I do clinical work, training and consultation, and then I also work through the early childhood family education program in Sauk Rapids, Rice, Minnesota, where I am project manager for a couple of projects. One of them is Greater St. Cloud Area Thrive. Some of you may have Thrive projects in your community and know about them. And an access project with immigrant and refugee families. And I also do some work at the Battered Women's Shelter, working with the birth to 5 population and their moms in the Battered Women's Shelter in our area. So those are some of the things that I am doing right now, and I'm very excited to be able to be here and to do this webinar with you folks.
And this is Michele. I am a licensed clinical social worker and also an infant early childhood mental health specialist. I do a variety of things, mostly training and consultation at this point, and I'm also very excited to be here. Nancy Jost wants to know why we can't see the presenters, and it's because the webinar isn't set up to allow that. So you just have to envision us as I described us at the beginning. And so you hopefully are all
a hard time envisioning.
Yeah, hopefully you all see the PowerPoint and hear our voices, and then know that it is interactive and that you can ask questions. So.
And I think we'll just say right at the beginning that our plan is that Michele and I will chat about these things as we go through. So try and stay a little informal. Would really love questions. I think that would be wonderful to be able to respond to the things you're most interested in. And we're going to start with a little piece that's going to be a little bit interactive. And since we haven't done it in this way before through a webinar, I've done the same thing in other ways, but usually face-to-face. So we'll see how this works. What we're going to ask you to do, we'll be starting with just kind of going through and reviewing a little bit of the first ACE study, or the some of the ACE studies that were done in 1995 and 1997, and then Michele will talk a little bit about the Minnesota ACE study so that you get a little bit of both. But in order to go through the first part, yes, Michele wants to say something.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, Jane. We're getting a little feedback, and this is for you, Michael, that people are having a hard time hearing. So I don't know if that can be adjusted, but there you go. So take it away, Jane.
All right. Well, I'll sit a little closer to the mic, at least to start with, and see if that makes a difference. So what I'm going to do is put up on the PowerPoint a question. And this is, one of those tests where you can just say what your first thought is, because honestly, we're not collecting these. We're not grading you on them. It doesn't matter. And we can't even tell who said what. So no stress here. But this is just a way to get you thinking about what you might think prior to hearing what was actually found from the ACE study. So a little bit of background first. In 1995, Kaiser Permanente, which is an insurance company, paid for a study to be done looking at the what impacts health. And this particular study, and you can throw in any other pieces here, Michele, about this.
I will.
Good, good. This particular study, what they ended up doing was looking at a group of people who come to a clinic, for their health care and sent out surveys about whether people had experienced particular adverse childhood experiences during their childhood. There's 10 adverse childhood experiences that they looked at. First they looked at 8, and then they raised it to 10, and Michelle's going to say something about that.
I think 2 important points about that is that this was done originally, I believe, in the San Diego area, certainly in California. And so this is an HMO that's doing this study, which means that the people who are taking these surveys, by and large, are middle-class folks who are employed or their spouses are employed because they have this health insurance. So that's an important thing to know. The other thing is to know that the study was implemented because they were trying to understand the underlying causes of 5 major, most expensive adult chronic diseases, including diabetes, heart disease, depression, obesity, and something else. Oh, yes. Yeah, I think it's high blood pressure.
Okay. Yep. So that's what they were looking at to begin with. And when they sent out the survey, again, they started with 8 adverse childhood experiences. And you'll find us starting to call these the ACEs. And so just know, because people have asked me that sometimes when I've done this and I start saying the ACEs, that what we mean by that is adverse childhood experiences. So I'm just going to say what some of those were. They were looking at substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, living in a household with domestic violence, parents who've had criminal behavior or have been incarcerated, looked at psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, and emotional and physical neglect. So those were some of the things that they were looking at. Oh, and Michele is looking like she's not sure what's going on over there. And they were very surprised that they received a large number of responses, about 75% response rate, which is excellent. And should I keep going, or is it? Yes, I can keep going. Okay. They got a good response rate, and when they started looking at the results of that survey, they were able to look at it in relationship to all of the medical records that they had on all of these people because they were part of the particular clinics that they were doing the survey for. So with that background, now I'm going to go to the slides where you get to vote. And what I'll do is I will read off the question, which you can read at the same time, and then just ask how many people think it's the first answer, how many people think it's the second, how many people think it's the third. And each time I ask, if you want to just raise your hand, Michele will be able to then tell us how many people thought it was each one of those answers.
Now, that's not your physical hand. That's putting your cursor on the little icon with the hand raised.
That's a really good point.
I didn't know that until it was explained to me this morning. We also, Jane, there's a question here about how was abuse defined. Did it include emotional and psychological abuse?
They separated those out. So they had physical abuse, emotional abuse. They had physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological or emotional abuse. Now, I think it's interesting to know a couple of things about how things were defined, because essentially what happened, if you look at the survey itself, is that they're very simple questions. They didn't go into a lot of definitions or explaining what they meant by those things. They just would say, did you have this experience as a child? The other thing is that they're talking about childhood basically being anything under 18. So it's not when you were 5 or when you were 8 or when you were 10. It was, did you have this experience when you were a child? They also did not ask how often that experience occurred. So, you know, it may be that one person had ongoing domestic violence. Another person may have had, they may have been in a household with domestic violence for a year. So it didn't, the survey was very simple and essentially just asked, did people have these experiences as a child? Now, as we talk more about this, we can, I think it's good to acknowledge that means that there are some problems with the initial study. But since that time, it's been quite a while since the first study, a number of different researchers have been trying to do the same study in a variety of different ways to make up for some of the problems with the way that the first study was designed. But right now we're going to just talk about what the results of the first study are, and then Michele will talk a little bit more about a more recent study that was done here in Minnesota, looking at the same questions. So I'm going to the first slide, and as Michele said, it was a relatively educated middle-class population. And what do you think was the incidence of this particular adverse childhood experience found in the study? So the first one we're going to look at is substance abuse. So this would be that how many people in this particular study said that they lived in a household where the parents abused substances. So how many people think that it's 12%? We'll give you a second to figure out this hand-raising thing. Remember, don't think hard. Just answer. There's no right or wrong. We'll tell you what the answer is. Are you getting it, Michele?
I don't see it, but Cindy is coming to my rescue.
It usually takes a minute for the answers to pop up, and so I see the little timer here on your right. We're going to see how many people, and pretty soon we should see a graph that shows us how many people voted on this. Sorry for the delays. We're working on our technical problems here. Michael is now coming to help us, and the answer is...
7.
7 out of 105.
7 out of 105 think it's 12%.
Okay, let's say 30%. How many think it's 30%?
$42%.
And how many think that it's 27%?
So 22% people.
22%. Okay, so the 30% got the most votes. We're just going to now look at what the correct answer is. And the correct answer is 27%. So 22% of the people who voted were correct. I'm going to whip through the next ones and not actually have you vote in that way. And then I'll move to some others where we can go back to voting. So just to get some of the incidence examples, I'm going to go to the next slide, which asks about what percentage of the respondents in the original ACE study said that they had, as a child, lived in a household where there was domestic violence. And just think in your head, do you think it was more 13%, 18%, 5%? Just a guess in your head about what that might be. And I'll show you, it was 13%. So 13% in this study. The next one is physical abuse. How many respondents said that they lived in a household where there was physical abuse, where they experienced physical abuse themselves? 28%, 12%, or 35%. You can think about that for a moment. Make a guess in your head. And the answer was 28%. So 28% experienced physical abuse. Sexual abuse, do you think that was 21%, 7%, or 18% that experienced sexual abuse in their childhood? And the answer is 21%. Physical neglect, was it 15%, 10%, or 25%? And the answer is 10%. Okay, I'm going to go back to that one. So the point of this piece is really just to say that one of the things that the researchers were really surprised, shocked at, was the incidence of adverse childhood experiences in people's lives. Again, as Michele said, and as it says on the slide, this was a relatively educated middle-class population that were coming regularly to an HMO clinic. So, you know, just looking at normal people, just people,
without obvious risk factors.
Without obvious risk factors, yes. And thinking about, so what's the incidence of adverse childhood experiences in that population? And they were shocked to realize how much children experience. So that's one of the things that this study really points out to us, that we need to do a better job of protecting children from these adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to go back to raising our hand now for a minute. This next question is, which adverse childhood experiences can have an effect on adult illness and early death? So take a look at A, growing up with substance and alcohol abuse, B, neglect, C, witnessing domestic violence, or D, all of the above. And how many, raise your hand if you think it's A.
%.
How many?
No, 1%.
1%. All right. How many think it's B?
One person.
All right. How many people think it's C?
One person.
And how many people think it's D? I'm guessing that the numbers are just piling up over there with me.
They are piling up.
And of course, all of you are correct because it's all of the above. So another thing that was really interesting about this study is that what they were looking at was adult illness and early death, as Michele had said earlier. And so they were really looking at medical issues. But what they found in the study was that there is a very, very strong correlation between all of these adverse childhood experiences and the top 5 illnesses that they were taking a look at in the study. And so all of you are very correct on that one. All of the above. So another thing that they found in the ACE study that was important was that ACEs occur in clusters. In other words, if you have one ACE, one adverse childhood experience, it's very likely you also are experiencing others, and that the more you experience, they talk about this as the dose response, that the more ACEs that a child experiences, the higher likelihood that it will have an impact on health. And we'll talk more about what that means later. But when we talk about ACEs, it's important to realize that we're talking about not how many times something happened to you, so how many times a physical abuse incident occurred, but how many of these different categories have occurred to a person. So if somebody responded that they experienced one of the ACEs, it's one of those categories. And if they say, I experienced 3 of those ACEs, it would be 3 of the categories. So keeping that in mind, let's answer this question. ACEs tend to occur in clusters. When a person has more than how many ACEs, they are how much more likely to marry an alcoholic, have an STD, have lung disease, or attempt suicide. A is 1 ACE, more than 40%. 2 is 2 ACEs, more than 75%. 3 is 3 ACEs, more than 10%, or 4 ACEs, more than 50%. So think for a second. How many people think that it's A?
%, 10%.
B?
%, 13%.
B?
Four people, or 3%.
And D?
It's zooming up. So we're at about 36 people, or 31%.
All right, so D's the big winner here. Let's see if that's the correct answer. Yes, it is. Way to go. Well done. You know, what's so important here is really to look at 4 ACEs more than 50% more likely. That's actually pretty shocking. Even though many of you figured that out, I think it was really surprising to the researchers when they saw that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, could make a 50% difference in their likelihood of experiencing these things that are listed here. Did you have anything else you want to say about that one, Michelle?
No, I think we're going to keep going.
All right, sounds good. So the next slide just gives a broader picture of that same question. So the more ACEs a child has, the higher risk to grow up and experience a number of different health and mental health and physical health problems.
So, and this became, so the study Jane's described in the original study, they went on to do, as Jane said, many, many more studies, like one looking specifically at adolescent pregnancy and how the incidence of that was related to the number of ACEs. And as you can imagine, it was highly correlated, again, with the number of ACEs. So that's where this additional information comes from.
Yeah. The next question is, says that research suggests that only 3% of children with an ACE score of 0 had learning or behavioral problems. For children with ACE score of 4, what percent had those problems? Is it 13, 10, 51, or 36? So let's, yeah. Michelle was just saying, we're going to just move forward a little more quickly here. So we'll just let you think about that for a second, and then I'll give you the answer. It's 51%. This one, there's another slide here that talks about the developmental impact. I do a lot of work with early intervention folks, with people who do early childhood special education work, and I think this is just such an important one for all of us to look at, that adverse childhood experiences so clearly have an impact on developmental delays. So many, many of the children who come into special education are coming in having had adverse childhood experiences that have impacted their development. Anything more you want to say?
Well, I just was thinking, I went to a training once with Robert Anda, who was one of the original people doing the study, and he made an interesting point, which was what they're finding is that if you talk to policymakers about reducing the incidence of child abuse, people are kind of like, yeah, ho-hum, of course, nobody likes child abuse. But if you talk to policymakers about we need to lower the cost of health care by reducing the incidence of these very costly chronic diseases in adulthood, people are much more willing to jump on the bandwagon, which is kind of depressing in a way, but on the other hand, hey, whatever it takes, right?
That's right, yep. Just back to that for 1 second. I think one of the things that this also helps us to rethink are some of the ways in which we intervene in developmental delays. Not to say that we know exactly what it means, but I think that we do need to rethink what that means. I think at some point we have thought about developmental delays primarily being something that children are born with. This really speaks to bringing some of that trauma-informed care into the work that we do in early childhood special education.
Well, and I think it also speaks, really endorses the model of home visiting. Because home visiting, you're addressing 2 generations. You're not just focused on the child, you're focused on the child in the context of the family.
Absolutely.
So, boy, you guys are great.
Yeah. Which we will say many times during this webinar. The second to last question we have here is just ACEs increase the risk of what? Brain defects, home accidents, or heart and lung disease? And the answer is heart and lung disease. This question sometimes trips people up, partly because the brain defects one. Clearly, it impacts brains, but not in terms of defects. Those are typically things that you're born with. But what the researchers saw was this very strong correlation between the dose of ACEs, the number of ACEs, and heart and lung disease. And that's a really, really interesting piece here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the last question here is a cholesterol reading above 240 milligrams per deciliter doubles your chance for heart disease. How do adverse childhood experiences impact heart disease? So you can read through these. Combined with cholesterol, a high ACE score increases risk by 12%. Or do you think a high ACE score doubles your chance for heart disease? Or an ACE score of 2 triples your likelihood of heart disease? Or adverse childhood experiences by themselves do not impact heart disease? And the answer to this one is that a high ACE score doubles your chance for heart disease. And this, combined with the one right before, I think is some of the most interesting pieces about the ACE study that has sparked interest, I think, because why is it that adverse childhood experiences impact things like heart and lung disease? What is the pathway by which that happens? The researchers initially were looking at something that I think comes to all of our minds, which is that adverse childhood experiences often will then create a situation in which a person will make bad choices. For example, if you've had adverse childhood experiences, you may feel worse about yourself. You might be more likely to abuse substances. You might be more likely to smoke. You might be more likely to overeat. Those things lead to all kinds of diseases. So that makes sense.
Somebody's asking, how could we define what is a high ACE score? How many ACEs make a score high?
That's an excellent question. And what they found was that the tipping point was at 4. That and you'll see as Michele goes through some charts that really show you how ACE scores are related to these things. You'll get to see more about this. But what they found was that 0, 1, 2 has effect, but it's not as significant, but it really shoots up 4 and above. Some of the work they have done has also been really looking at people with multiple ACE experiences. So people who have 7 or more is another tipping point that they've looked at. But 4 and above is considered a high ACE score. That was an excellent question. That's really good.
And do all the ACEs have equal adverse impact? And again, I think the answer is it's the cumulative effect which really matters.
It is, although they also have done some work looking at different specific ones and specific diseases, and connecting, like there was one that I was noticing as I was going through my notes where if you look at that particular one, it didn't have nearly as much of an impact on obesity as it did on lung disease or something like that. So they have really parceled it out, and you can say something about the site that people can go to get more information.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really critical to remember that as when we talk about risk in other contexts and trauma and so forth, like that, adverse childhood experiences are not destiny. That we're going to go into a little bit into resiliency here, but we're looking at statistics here, and that we all know individuals. We may be individuals who may have had 4 or more ACE scores, and resiliency won out for various reasons. So again, it's really important to know that this isn't destiny.
As a matter of fact, Chandra Gosh-Ippen, I don't know if anyone knows of her, but she does work in the Child Traumatic Stress Network. She does a lovely job of showing famous people that we know who've obviously been incredibly successful and done really well, who have more than 4 ACEs. So it's just a nice way of saying this isn't. It's statistics. It's not about important statistics that we really need to take seriously.
Right. But what Jane was referring to earlier is that the Minnesota data, all of the ACE stuff is on the CDC website, the Center for Disease Control out of Atlanta. So if you went on their website and put in ACEs, you would pull up a number of studies. But more recently now that Minnesota has done our own version specific to our state, the Minnesota Department of Health has that information. Their executive summary has been available for a while on that site, but just in the last few days, I believe, they've released their full report, which is downloadable. So again, go to the Minnesota Department of Health website and put in adverse childhood experiences.
So I just wanted to say a couple more little things about the initial study and then pass it over to Michele to talk more about that Minnesota study. So when we asked this question about the cholesterol reading and heart disease, what's so fascinating to think about with that is how much money we put into medications for heart disease, lowering cholesterol, because we know that high cholesterol doubles your chance for heart disease. So it's an incredibly, it's viewed medically as an incredibly important thing to put money into. But if you look at this, we also know that a high ACE score of 4 or more doubles your chance for heart disease. So it's the same result, but we may not think about that first. We may think about, in terms of where we put our resources. We put resources into medications for cholesterol, but don't necessarily put resources into addressing ACEs, which have the same result. The other thing is where I was talking about how one way the researchers thought was the pathway between ACEs and disease is through behavior. But when they first did this study, one of the things that they said was they weren't quite sure how this happens. They were saying that they can see very clearly it happens, but what is the pathway that makes it happen? So the researchers looked actually at patients with ACE scores of 7 or higher who didn't smoke, didn't drink to excess, weren't overweight, and found their risk of heart disease was 360% higher than it was for patients with a score of 0. This is really key because that opened up a whole ton of research, which was already starting to go on and has been going on since then, looking at what does high stress do to our bodies physically, and what are the pathways by which that happens. So we need to look at how adverse childhood experiences impacts behavior, which impacts health. But we also need to look at that adverse childhood experiences in themselves have an impact on our physiology, on our bodies, in a way that has long-term consequences for our health.
Right. Remember that if those of you who attended the trauma series last year, that one of the effects of toxic stress, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today, which is that high level of kind of ongoing stress with too little support. It actually suppresses our immune system because the mechanisms in our brain that allow us to survive have to be channeled in other ways, and it detracts from the immune system. So that's one of the mechanisms that's being looked at.
I'm going to pass it over to Michele, who will talk about, there you go, who's going to talk about the Minnesota study.
So we were the 18th state to begin to gather this data. And this data was gathered, there's a questionnaire called the Behavioral Risk Surveillance System that's been ongoing, I believe, for a number of years. And what they did was add the specific ACE questions to the survey that was already being done. And so you can see from the map here that, and again, this is available on the web, that we kind of joined the bandwagon to look specifically at what we have in our state. So I think Jane made this point really nicely in a broader context, but there are three key points to emphasize again: that ACEs are common, much more common than we might originally have believed. Because for those of us in home visiting, we're serving specifically, for the most part, a high-risk population. But again, this is a questionnaire that goes out to the general Minnesota population, and 55% of us have experienced one or more of these ACEs. And then that the ACEs, as Jane said, are interrelated, that of Minnesotans who have one ACE, so 55% of Minnesotans have at least one ACE, of those, 87% have more than one ACE. So again, then that ties into the third point, which is the concern is this biological stress dose that matters. It's the cumulative effect with 4 ACEs, again, statistically being kind of the tipping point that's considered a high score that that makes you most vulnerable to these effects. So I guess not surprisingly, and again, I encourage you to go to the MDH website for more complete information. But not surprisingly, ACEs were more common among Minnesotans who were less well educated and who were struggling economically and had struggles with employment as well. And this gives us an idea of the specific health outcomes they were looking at, which was, you can see across the bottom here: asthma, diabetes, obesity, depression, anxiety, chronic drinking, current smoking, and poor to health that's considered poor to fair. That you can see the color coding that correlates with the number of ACEs a person has. And so that you can see, in this case, they were looking at 5, greater than 5, is quite dramatic for most of these illnesses in terms of showing quite a spike. But that just gives you some idea of what it looks like specifically here in Minnesota. When they looked at the prevalence of these individual ACEs, this is what they found in terms of the 55% of Minnesotans who have one or more ACEs. These are the statistics on which of these adverse childhood experiences people had actually had. So I believe incarceration of a parent was at about 7%, compared to verbal abuse, which was at about 28% of these folks described having experienced verbal, which I think we can equate with psychological or emotional abuse at some point during their childhood. And so then you can see how the rest of these, so the most common ones for us in Minnesota were living with a separated or divorced parent, a parent with a drinking problem. And again, in Minnesota, they pulled apart, it wasn't just substance abuse. As you can see, the third pillar here is drug use. But drinking, living with a parent with a drinking problem, is much more common. And as I think most of us in home visiting know, mental health, the mental illness in the household is not insignificant here in terms of how many of us in the state have grown up living with someone in our household who has mental illness.
One thing I know people often wonder, because this is a survey that's given to adults, and the fact that it's the adults thinking back on their childhood, whether so it's a retrospective survey rather than a looking forward and starting from childhood and then noting when these occurrences, happen, and then moving from there and taking a look at health outcomes. And so I just wanted to say that there are studies that have done this the other way around and are continuing to watch and see whether the results are similar, and what they're coming up with are very similar results. And so that's something that people often ask about the study.
As research goes, the findings in all of the studies related to adverse childhood experiences are remarkably robust.
They are, yeah. and they continue to be, even when they try and switch around the study to make sure that they're adjusting for people's memories being different, or maybe people just make excuses for themselves by saying they had all these. That's what some people have said. So they've really turned it around and found some of the same results.
So this would be of the Minnesotans having 55, of the 55% of Minnesotans who have one or more A's, you will see that 60%, so the four little shapes on the right, parts of the circle, comprises 60% of us, of those of us who have one or more aces. One ace have more than one ace. Did I say that? Was that pretty confusing?
I think we know what you mean, though.
Okay.
50% have two or more aces.
So again,
of the 55.
And it's knowing that it's the cumulative effect of the aces that matters. I think it's a striking statistic. I should say that all of these numbers that we're throwing around are very consistent with the numbers in the national studies and in the 17 other states who have done this. So again, more data for how robust these findings are is that our profile in this state is right on track with some very minor differences with all of the other states who've been tracking this information. So I want to give you a little hope. We're going to watch a little video, talk a little more about trauma, and then about 9:30 we're going to take about a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to focus on strategies, in case you wondered if we were ever going to get there. We are. So Michael warned us that because we're showing a video in this way, and this is just a little 4-minute video that many of you may have already seen from the Center on the Developing Child, it will be kind of choppy, but hopefully the sound, which is what's most important, will come through. So here we go.
We know from research on the biology of stress that negative impact of that during sensitive periods of time that's going to sculpt the architecture of the brain can have effects on learning behavior and physical and mental health.
What this is allowing us to say is that these experiences that children come across, that we provide them with in those first 3 or 4 or 5 years, provides the scaffolding. Doesn't guarantee a perfect life later on, but it, in a sense, is an insurance policy. Some experiences are more important early in life than later in life, and therefore it argues for investing in what happens in those first 3 to 5 years.
So persistent stress changes brain architecture. Let me show you this. We know that there are changes in the structure of the nerve cell that's responsible for communication, for the ability of children to respond in their world. This is a typical neuron sitting in the prefrontal cortex. This is a neuron that after it undergoes chronic stress during development, this is the way it ends up. So toxic stress results in architectural changes of fewer connections.
It's not only are they at risk for drug and alcohol dependence, but other aspects of their biology. They're at risk for depression. Maybe nobody's surprised by that. They're at risk for cardiovascular disease earlier.
It's not as though the die is cast and the door slams shut, but it will say to us, if you want to get this kid back on a typical developmental trajectory, if you wait too late, it's going to be like pushing open a 1,000-pound door instead of just having it swing open very gently, which you can do with the right early experiences. The second is, as we understand how experience affects the brain, we're in a better position to do 2 things: to identify as early in life as possible kids who are at risk for falling off a typical developmental trajectory. And the second is to develop interventions that target specific circuits in the brain.
There's a critical period. There's a period of time during which this profound neglect that they've experienced, right, requires an intervention and enrichment, and it has to happen within a certain period of time in order for it to have its most powerful effects.
The most important ingredient in positive experiences for young children is the responsive adult or set of adults that are there in the child's life, who are helping to let that brain be excited about learning and supporting that brain's development.
In addition to trying to focus on getting
to the most at-risk populations as soon as possible, and that would be before birth. If I had to just focus on dealing with the situations after birth where you have an infant or you have a toddler, that developing daycare systems where we rank them in terms of their quality, where we provide the resources to encourage them to hire the very best staff. You can't do it on the cheap. That if we start with those systems and generate systems of excellence early and apply those to the most at-risk individuals, that's where we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck.
And that if we then continue to be mindful of how experience writes on the brain, then we're much more likely to have children who wind up being successful, happy, productive citizens of society.
If you want to just write down the direct link to this specific video, or just go to centeronthedevelopingchild.org. It's all one word. Again, centeronthedevelopingchild.org. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. Basically what we're saying is, and again, this is a slide taken directly from the presentation that we all did last year on trauma, that when there is a continuum of stress, and that not all stress is bad for us. Stress, small doses of stress can actually motivate us. So you see that often that before infants achieve a major developmental milestone, they become more irritable, their biological rhythms may be thrown off. And for example, the 6-month-old who's not quite able to sit yet, you can see some of that frustration. If we don't experience a certain amount of stress, we're less likely to move forward and make progress in our lives. The key, though, of course, with children is that requires adult support to help them manage that stress, manage that frustration, to make it at a dose that a young child can tolerate. And as we know, that varies depending on the age of the child. An infant will be more vulnerable to certain stressors than a 3-year-old. So the example we might use would be, I think Carol and Scott used this last time as well, where let's see, if a 1-year-old is bitten by a dog, that is likely to have a more long-lasting effect on the child in terms of probably fear of dogs, something like that, than, let's say, a 3 or 4-year-old who's bitten by a dog who has a way to process that experience verbally. And so that's what we mean by kind of needing adult support to sort of mitigate the dose of stress and then be there for the stress. So that leads us into tolerable stress, which is something we may not wish happens, like a child being bitten by a dog, like a child who has to undergo a painful and invasive medical procedure. But that how the child experiences that degree of stress is going to be profoundly impacted by the amount of adult support, social support that the child has to go through that. That it's the relationships and the adult support that will contribute hugely to the resiliency, the resilience that a child can develop coming out of many of those experiences. So the one we think of, I think, most is the toxic stress, which is what we really want to avoid, because that relates directly to the ACEs. We're seeing that it's the cumulative effect of multiple ACEs that creates a biological stress dose, so to speak, of toxic stress that really impacts brain development in significant ways and increases our risk for stress-related physical and mental illness. So again, all the stuff we've talked about with trauma and toxic stress in the past in these other webinars and workshops for the Home Visiting Coalition, you see how the ACEs link directly to that.
So, just thinking about this, Michele, and how what we know about ACEs and well, we've always known that adverse childhood experiences aren't good for children, and the ACE study gives us just more ammunition to say this not only impacts mental health, but it also impacts physical health. It gives us all of that. But how we've thought about stress and what's tolerable and what's good stress and then what's toxic stress really goes along with that, what is the dose of ACEs, as well as, and the one thing that the ACEs study doesn't look at all, which is whether there is a regulating partner there to help make the child more resilient. So what we're seeing here is that, 4 and more ACEs certainly seems to be getting to toxic stress. I mean, that's what we're talking about here.
Right. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Don't hesitate to type them on in. I think this takes us again to what we mentioned earlier about the beauty of home visiting as a model to address these, is because in this context of ACEs, it becomes obvious to those of us in home visiting, it validates this idea that we need to address two generations, both the parent and the child, the parent/caregiver and the child, to end multi-generational transmission of the mechanisms by which this becomes an ongoing multi-generational issue. So it's a way of how can we help parents sometimes begin to connect the dots. So this is merging a bit into strategies, but the idea that if we say to a parent, for example, do you remember a time when someone comforted you when you were hurt? Or do you remember a time when someone held you? And you may get a response that says, nobody ever did that for me. Well, what was that like for you? Or you may hear a positive, and so what was that like for you? So in those questions, we're helping a parent connect the dots between their past and what that experience was like for them. In other words, trying to promote empathy for oneself. And then what would you like that to be like for your child? Which takes us forward into, again, if that's how you felt under those circumstances, I wonder what it's like for your child when he cries and you don't pick him up. And this is a more subtle way of trying to get to that. But also hugely trying to bring into consciousness for families, for parents, the idea that they can choose what kind of parent they want to be. They don't have to repeat history, because so much about parenting lies in the unconscious. And I'm sure many of us have had the experience of saying something, hearing the words come out of our mouth and think, oh my God, I'm my mother. That's what we're talking about. So again, it's this idea of helping families connect these dots and working it in positive ways too. I noticed you seem to really pick up quickly on the fact that your child was hungry. How did you know? What told you that your child needed to eat? And how did you learn that? So we want to acknowledge the positive pieces of history for families, as well as things that we may know are negative. Again, just to reinforce the idea that they can choose how they want parenting to go for them and their children.
So what we're really talking about here is that the ACE study leaves us with two pathways to address what we learned from the ACE study. I mean, there's the pathway that is about knowing that toxic stress is harmful both for mental health and physical health, and wanting to address that experience of toxic stress by providing as much as we can to families to have the children be as resilient to that toxic stress as possible. And the other side is to prevent ACEs from occurring to children. So one pathway is that we want to protect children from adverse childhood experiences. We want to make policies and put resources towards making sure that that does not happen. And the other pathway is addressing it in families. And that's where Michele was really going, was in terms of, we know that toxic stress is bad. We now know not only is it bad, but it's really bad for our physical health as well, long term. We really need to make sure that we do whatever we can to surround families where there is a lot of toxic stress with what can be done to help make resilience or create resilience.
So Jane, I'm thinking this would be a good time for that 5-minute break.
Yeah, I think it would be excellent. Yeah.
And we have one unanswered question, and this would be a great time, too, if you want to type in any questions you have. And we'll look at those during the break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thanks. And we're back. Hopefully you are too.
So before we get started, I am going to let you know that this is the third of a series of 4 webinars, and that the 4th webinar is going to be focused on home visiting with immigrant and refugee families, and that one is scheduled for October 3rd, which is a Thursday, from 8:30 to 10:30 on October 3rd. So if you would be interested in that webinar, then you can make sure to register for that one as well. Carol Siegel and I, this is Jane, are going to be presenting on that topic. And because we keep joking about the fact that here are 2 white women talking about home visiting with immigrant and refugee families, that we will be bringing voices in from immigrant and refugee families that we work with, and also from home visitors who do that kind of work. So we'll be hopefully bringing some other voices into the conversation and talking about home visiting with immigrant and refugee families. So
I've seen them present. It's really cool.
So moving on with our ACE study.
I did want to just address the question.
Yes, good.
One of you asked, where can we reference the definition of the ACEs, such as verbal abuse? Excellent question, and we were conversing about it at the break. And interestingly, we have not seen a definition, because when you look at the ACE questions themselves, it isn't defined in the question. So I think it is, as far as we know, there isn't a specific definition, but it's an excellent question. The other question is growing up in a single-parent household considered an ACE as much as experiencing the separation of divorce of one's parents?
And I just sneezed. Sorry. That was funny.
Okay.
So, you know, a couple of things about that. One is that I don't think that, so growing up in a single-parent household was not one of the ACEs that was studied. So it wasn't considered an adverse childhood experience that was studied. And so in terms of the ACE study itself, I think we can say that they aren't saying one way or the other in their particular study. So just to be clear that I don't think that they address that question.
No, I think it's the stress of losing a parent.
Yeah, I think we can address it by just saying that from our understanding of young children and development, that separation and divorce has other stressors that are related to losing a parent and possibly the conflict in the process that are very different from growing up in a single-parent household. Old studies that about traits of a healthy family from years and years and years ago really looked at whether single parenting or more than one parent has an effect in itself on children's success, and in those studies, at least, it was saying no. So, you know, those are just some responses to that question. I don't think, in terms of the ACE study specifically, we don't have a response. Our particular perspective is that the divorce and separation has other stressors that would be of concern.
And yet, even in thinking about divorce and separation, remember we're looking at statistics, and these questions are not nuanced. They're just, did you experience it? I mean, there are people who get divorced better than others in terms of the children's experience. So I think, you know, obviously we have to pay attention to all of that.
So just moving forward and thinking about what do we do with this ACE study as home visitors? Like, how do we use this ACE study as home visitors? And one of the things that I just, as Michele and I were putting this together, I said, you know, I wonder how much people would or wouldn't share the ACE study with parents. And I think as home visitors, there would be reasons to share some of it, and there would be reasons not to share it. But I thought that it was something that was worth at least having a little conversation about, and getting Michele in here to talk about it as well. But as I thought about it, I think I have shared it once in a while, The reason not to is because for parents where there have been many of those experiences in their children's lives, it could just be really depressing and hard to hear that not only are their children being impacted possibly in terms of their mental health around those experiences, but also that it could have long-term physical impacts for them, that their physical health could be impacted long-term. On the other hand, for parents to understand that their own experiences, early childhood experiences, are really important and could have an impact, that could be a positive thing. So I think that in each situation, obviously, a home visitor might think about it differently. But then I just kind of thought about what might be the key points that I might want to share at one point or another from the ACE study with parents. And if any of you want to type in anything, Michelle's watching those comments and questions, and feel free. But one thing is just that stress and trauma when we are young is bad for our physical as well as mental health. As caregivers, we can help minimize these effects. And that's that piece that I always am wanting to do as a home visitor with families, is to give, this is hard, and let's not pretend that this isn't hard, and we can do something about it, rather than this is hard, bleh, and that's it. We're not going to be able to do anything about it. So holding both of those, but acknowledging that stress and trauma are bad for our heart for young kids. And I think about that sometimes when I work in the battered women's shelter. And at what points and in what ways do I share with parents how much domestic violence can impact their young children?
I think we often think about this in the context of brain development, that we talk about the child's growing brain and the vulnerability to stress and how toxic stress changes the architecture of the brain, I think is the phrase that's often used. But we're really talking about the same stuff, just from different perspectives.
Yep, that's very true. So another thing that I might want to talk to a parent about, and it may be that this would be something that I would want to talk to a foster parent about, which is what the ACE study helps inform us about in terms of the impact on developmental delays, that being able to have that information as a foster parent who has a child that's in their care who has delays, and to recognize that some of those delays may be coming from some of the adverse experiences that the child has had, or the trauma that the child has experienced. So that might be another time that I could see myself sharing some of this experience.
And again, we can take that into the context of a child, if a child has had all of this trauma and adverse childhood experiences, in the absence of a regulating partner, in other words, how can a child learn to regulate their level of arousal and their ability to attend, their ability to regulate emotion? And if they can't do that, how can they learn? So again, there are ways to talk about this that I think can really help parents link these together in a way that's non-judgmental and is more to engender, I think, sometimes empathy for the child's experience or for the parent's own experience.
Absolutely. So another thing, just thinking about how I might say some of this, would be that everybody experiences some bad stuff in their lives. But this study says the worst effects come when there are more than 4 adverse experiences in childhood. And the way I might see myself possibly using that would be if I wanted to say to a parent, you know, yeah, bad stuff happens. Things have happened already with your child. And it's going to be really important for us to make sure that your child is protected from too much of this, that a lot really makes a difference. So that might be another way that I might approach it. And then I just put on the bottom here that always remembering that it's not about 4 events, it's about 4 categories, 4 ongoing experiences, such as living in a household with domestic violence. So when we're talking about more than 4, it's not that the child has experienced domestic violence more than 4 times, although clearly that would also be relevant. But in terms of this ACE study, it's about 4 categories. So that was just my attempt to answer that question about whether I would say this stuff to parents and in what way as a home visitor, and what might be useful and what might not be as useful when talking with parents. So back to kind of where this ACE study brings us. It says on this slide that the hope of the research is to demonstrate that by reducing ACEs, we can reliably expect a reduction in many ACE-related health and social problems. So clearly, one of the things that the ACE study says to us is we want to reduce ACEs. And to a great extent, that is a policy and policy issue and resource issue. So it behooves us as a society to look at that and to consider how are we going to make sure to reduce ACEs. That also comes to the slide before where sometimes it's bringing to parents that it's really important that we don't have our children be exposed to so many difficult things in their lives. Some things parents have some control over, many things they don't at that point. But the other pathway is this idea of resiliency. And as home visitors, that's probably the path that we have the greatest influence on. And so when Michele and I talked about doing this, we talked about let's go back to some of the resiliency information, both from if you did the webinar with Carol Siegel and Scott Harmon, then they talked a lot about resiliency, and so we'll be referring to some of that in this next section. But also just in general as home visitors, how do we make sure we support resiliency when we know that families are experiencing a number of the ACEs?
And I think, you know, so many of us are using attachment-based models, and I think that's really important, and Jane's going to be talking about that. But in terms of how we define success, I think resiliency is a really more useful way to think about our successes. That if we're going for the gold standard of secure attachments, I think very often we'll be disappointed. But by strengthening relationships and all of that, we are creating resiliency and giving people coping strategies, because chances are we're not going to reduce the stress they're living under, you know, to a great extent at least. So I love the term resiliency.
This is a lovely little picture of a flower that was very resilient and coming up through the crack in the cement or the rock.
Life finds a way.
Yes, indeed. So just again, whether you did or did not have a chance to experience Scott and Carol's webinar, they did a really nice job of talking about resiliency and how to support resiliency and what we now know about the science of resiliency. Because just as we understand that ACEs and trauma impact physical health as well as mental health, and that it's all interconnected, we also know that about resiliency. That resiliency is, to some extent, developed. Some pieces can come in from, you know, how you're genetically loaded. What do you have genetically? But and a lot of it is how that interacts with your experience in your environment. So we build resiliency. Resilience is the ability to bend without breaking. That's kind of a definition: successful adaptation and coping in spite of risks. It's a developmental process, and it's a complex system, not an inborn capacity. And I think those two really speak to our role as home visitors in supporting and building resilience in the families and children and parents that we work with. And
I think that last point is so important, because there was a time when we really believed, I think, that resiliency was something you were born with or not, and how two children in the same family could take such different pathways. It's sort of almost like it's destiny. And again, as is the case with, you know, brain development and everything we've learned, it is so much more complex, and that's actually really good news.
Yeah, it is. Exactly.
A lot more
You don't even have it or
involved,
not.
but,
Yeah, exactly. So again, from Carol and Scott's webinar, just looking at what is the typical development of resilience, and the reason to look at this is to think about how can we intervene in order to support the development of resilience. And it's really about regulatory skills. And I just want to keep going back to one of the things that the ACE study tells us is that when we experience high levels of toxic stress, our bodies have certain reactions. And so this ability to regulate is incredibly important. And that is so connected to our long-term physical health. So if we can build regulatory skills in the parents and children that we work with, we are actually impacting their long-term physical health. Things like lung disease, heart disease, things of that sort. We're impacting so much more than we ever thought, which is important.
And think of what that means for those of us who do this really hard work. I mean, it's about us too. And you know, what are the individual coping strategies that we have to sort of ameliorate the stress of our jobs, whether it's developing a real good ability to compartmentalize, in other words, leave my work at work, whether it's, I don't know, yoga, ice cream. Oh, maybe that's not so good. But I think we all have a different set of those coping strategies. And so we're talking about all of us here, not just the families that we work with.
So just a couple of points from this slide that I think are so important that Michele is referring to is that regulatory skills are developed through effective partnering with an adult. So that's that piece that we as home visitors have so much of an impact on. We're partnering with the adult so that the adult can partner with the child. It's that parallel process thing we're talking about. And again, from their webinar, some of the contributors to resilience, that some of them we as home visitors can impact. Basic needs met, protection from violence, chronic stress, and trauma, caring and supportive relationships, the capacity to manage strong feelings, positive view of self, and skills in executive functioning. So, you know, every time we do any of this work, we basically come back down to, so it really is about relationship. And every time I go to any kind of presentation about early childhood mental health, I always walk out thinking once again, so it really is about relationships. So we're really, I mean, the focus is that our home visiting work is about supporting relationship in order to impact what we know can be the negative consequences of adverse childhood experiences. And we know that secure attachment is the best protective factor. This is something that I so often say to the folks at the battered women's shelter, the moms that I am talking to about their young children, that the best protective factor for their child in terms of the likelihood that what they've experienced will have long-term negative impacts will be a strong relationship with their primary caregiver, which at that point, when I'm talking to the moms in the battered women's shelter, is them. And so, and I just think that's an incredibly important thing for all of us to keep in mind and that we can share with parents. Chandra Ghosh-Ippen, who does the work with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and does a lot of work in child-parent psychotherapy that's trauma-focused, talks about building and repairing the protective shield, that when there are incidences of trauma in a child's life, that it is one of the essential things that we need to be doing is to help rebuild the child's experience of the parent as being a protective shield, which has been torn apart by the trauma, particularly when the parent is part of the trauma that does that even to a greater extent. We know that regulatory skills, I was talking about needing to build regulatory skills as part of building resilience for children and parents, and that occurs through effective partnering with an adult. So it's, again, all about relationship. And we know that the neurobiology of resilience is built within the relationship between a child and a primary caregiver.
And again, I think one of the arguments for our home visiting models, you know, to start ideally in pregnancy, but certainly as soon as possible after the birth of a child, is that there is a time-sensitive component to the development of self-regulation. We can all learn to improve our self-regulation. Some of us are working on that still and will for a lifetime. However, it's like language, the development of regulation and the need for that co-regulating partner to even to move along that trajectory towards self-regulation ideally happens from birth.
So we're back to needing to work on relationship and within that context build resilience. So in terms of using relationship to build resilience, 3 components that we'll focus on right now. One is building the caregiver's relational capacity, the ability to be in relationship, do relationship well, building a caregiver's reflective capacity, to think about the child, to reflect on behavior, etc., and building the caregiver's regulatory capacity, the ability of the caregiver to actually regulate the child and themselves. So these are all the pieces that, as home visitors, we do. And when Michele and I talked about doing this, we really talked about how so much of what home visitors do is exactly what needs to be done in terms of addressing adverse childhood experiences. So kudos to home visitors.
Again.
Again. So just first looking at building relational capacity, and this is where we want to just talk a little bit about kind of strategies, going back to strategies. What do we do in the work? And part of it is using the concept of parallel process, remembering that the way you want the caregiver to treat the child is the same as the way you need to treat the caregiver. So I'm kind of assuming that people have heard this idea before. That may or may not be true, but I think that a lot of us have talked about this question of parallel process. So I'm just going to give you a little listening activity that I learned a long, long time ago that can be used in trying to develop some of this parallel process. But I think Michele wants to say something.
Just before you go into that, somebody's requesting that you go back to the slide of the contributors to resiliency again.
So there it is. Basic needs met, protection from violence, chronic stress and trauma, caring and supportive relationships, the capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses, a positive view of the self, and skills in executive functioning.
Right, and this, the PowerPoint is available for you to download as a handout. Probably should have told you that at the beginning.
Yeah, I suppose.
Sorry.
Yeah. An assumption.
An assumption, yeah.
So just in one of the activities that I've used sometimes I've used it in groups of parents. Sometimes I've used it one-on-one with parents in a home visit. But it's a very simple listening activity. You ask the person to think about the persons they would most like to go talk to when something really difficult has happened in their life. And then you ask them to think about what are the qualities of the way that person responds to you or listens to you or whatever that makes it that you want to go talk to them. And then you can make a list of those qualities, and then you can have them think about a person that they would least like to go to talk to when something really difficult has happened in their life, and ask them to think about what are the qualities of the way that interaction goes that makes you not want to go to them. And then just slip it in their minds to, let's think about your child and when your child is coming to you. What are some of the qualities that they need in your relationship with them that you can see in this process that we just talked about in this activity that we just did. So it's something that it's just a very simple thing, and in some ways it's so obvious, but honestly it's kind of interesting to do and to think about kids that way. Way of thinking about kids.
Would you be willing to tell your Noah story about that, the eye contact when he was 2, your decision when you were multitasking?
Sure. It's a little different from this, but I'll tell it anyway, and we'll see if Michele can figure out, tell me how she made the link in her mind. So my experience when my son Noah was very young, and we weren't doing all that well right then. I don't know what was going on, but just our relationship wasn't going that well, and he was getting whiny and whatever, all those kinds of things that kind of irritate you about kids, and I just decided that I was going to do one change, which was simply to look at him when he came to talk to me. That was the only thing I was going to change. And what I found was that I was so often, I was doing the dishes and he would be talking to me and I would say, yeah, blah, 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 and I would kind of respond and try and give him answers and things like that, but it would always be to the side. And so the only change I made was to stop and look at him and when he talked to me, and it actually made a huge change in our relationship. It just calmed him down, it regulated him completely, etc. So Michele, what's the connection here with the loving activity?
Well, because it just seems to me that I first heard that story, I just thought it was such a lovely illustration of when you did that, my assumption is Noah felt he had your full attention.
Yeah.
And you were holding him.
Yeah.
He was the most important thing in the moment, hearing what he had to say, which to me is a huge characteristic of what I would want. I'm hoping to be listened to.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I just think it's a concrete example of how this activity might, where it might lead.
That's absolutely right.
Parent discovering.
Well done.
Hey, your story.
But that's absolutely true. It is. It's a concrete example, and it's interesting because I've certainly done this listening activity with parents who don't have multiple risk factors and are, doing quite well in parenting, but they're just having a rough time with their kids, and it's opened their eyes, and they've thought about their children in a different way. So it's just a little activity that you can think about using. And then when we talk about relationship, always thinking about attachment. And these are just some of the things that I think about doing in terms of supporting attachment. And again, I do a lot of supporting attachment types of activities or experiences, particularly with the parents of children in the battered women's shelter, because I believe so strongly with those really little ones, with the birth to 3, that is the best way that we can protect them from long-term consequences. So one of the things that I always do is just talk with the parent about setting up sacred time, and that's within the context of, at the battered women's shelter, moms are coming in with 3 million things that they have to do, tons of things that they have to think about, emotional trauma, just stress. There's so much on their minds, and much of it, they absolutely, it has to be on their minds. So some of it is emotional trauma at that time, and a lot of it is just really concrete things like, where am I going to live next? How am I going to have money? Should I stay in St. Cloud? Should I go to the cities, et cetera? All of those kinds of things. So within that context, I really talk with them about, let's set aside an hour a week. So we can only do an hour a week. And maybe you, as parents, can set aside an hour a day, or maybe a half hour or 15 minutes, but as sacred time to just focus on your child, because they're going through this too. And it's a way of helping people put some boundaries around really focusing on that relationship.
I love that term, Jane. I mean, back in the day when my kids were young, we talked about having special time or quality time. There's something about sacred time that I think really captures really how important that is, even if it's, as you say, 10 or 15 minutes when the child feels they have the full attention and admiration of the parent. I love that. I love your term.
So another piece I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of building the parent's ability to do relationships is back to that parallel process idea and being a regulatory partner yourself. So I just always want to say to home visitors, when you're in a household where the parent is completely unregulated, is having a hard time, and all you can do is to be regulatory for that parent. That's all you can do. That is huge. And that's really the thing I want to say here, is that piece is huge. I remember one time a parent in our family literacy program, something happened, and she was furious with the staff. And what she decided to do was, with that fury, go get her 3- and 2-year-old and leave the building. So all I did was kind of wander after her and keep kind of saying, if you need anything, I'm here. We can do this together. This is really hard, etc. But all I did was kind of wander after her. But knowing how important it was just to help regulate her within the context of this interaction with her children as she was ripping them out of child care without any warning and taking them out of the building. That job that I did was really important. And in the end, that particular parent came back to the program saying, this was the only place where people stood by me and really listened. And that just was so important. So it just has really struck me, that role of being a regulatory partner, if that's all you get done, you've done a huge job.
On that same note, is it Chandra Gaushippan's phrase, when you're in that situation, the first person to regulate is yourself?
I don't remember for sure, but it's
a
good thing to say.
And dang, is that hard.
Oh my gosh,
when you're
after her, I was having a hard time.
Oh, I'm sure.
I was deep breathing.
So it is that you know, we have to be, because it's hard to stay regulated in the presence, particularly when there's a young child. But just to remember that that's our first responsibility, is to stay regulated so that we can be the regulating partner. And faking it is okay. Sorry.
And keeping this connection with the ACE study here, I just remember that simply regulating our physical response, thus regulating the parent's physical response, thus regulating the child's physical response, is having an impact on long-term health. I mean, just keep that in mind, that that's how important this is. I have interactive activities here because I always think we have a tendency, parents have a tendency, for a very good reason, because lots of people have said how important it is that parents are the first teachers and they should teach their children, etc. So much of what they do when they're interacting with their children is either disciplining or teaching, that finding ways that you can develop activities that are all about just interacting, that is something that we can build, that capacity to just be in relationship and interact. So I develop interactive activities for the children who I work with their parents, and make sure that oftentimes we bring those into the home visiting experience as much as possible. And then the other thing about supporting attachment, I think that as we understand our trauma frames, as we understand the impact of trauma on behavior, that we can share that understanding with parents so that they understand their children's behavior. When there have been a number of adverse childhood experiences for that child, and we don't have to call it that for the parent, but we know that they've experienced the domestic violence, they've experienced multiple moves, they've experienced one of their parents with mental health issues, etc., that giving that parent, that caregiver, understanding of that trauma frame will help them to understand where the behavior is coming from and respond to it in a way that is more regulatory than it is disciplinary. Are you seeing a question there?
I am, actually. Which interactive activities do you find parents most receptive to and willing to engage in?
Well, all I can say is that I create ones that are for versatile, and they are so simple. And as soon as the child is enjoying it and the parent is enjoying it, then it often goes well. So Michele is pointing out to me that I have some of them here. So it's on your, some of them are on your PowerPoint. You know what I think I'm going to do? I think I'm going to go back, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So I will respond to some of that question as I get to that slide. Because I just wanted to say this piece about the power of delight. I don't want to forget it. On the circle of security, they put, and you may or may not have heard of the circle of security before or not, but that's okay either way. But just the point is that they put delight in a couple of different places on the circle. And the reason that they keep it in both places is because it is so powerful. So we want parents to delight in their children as they're exploring the world, and delight in their children as they come back to them to receive nurture. And what we have learned through a lot of the neurobiological research that's been done lately is that delight has physiological impacts that will set children up for resilience. And this talks about some of what those are. That sense of delight, those feelings, those chemicals, they trigger the ability of the caregiver to be in relationship with a child in a positive way, to want to bond, to want to connect, to want to do some of these things. So when somebody asks what activities will parents participate in, part of it is finding those activities that bring delight into that relationship. And every home visiting family is going to be different in terms of what they enjoy, but that power of delight is just incredibly important. It's also interesting to know that the love chemicals, or the delight chemicals that they've discovered, occur when we are enjoying each other. Also lessens behavior that is towards isolating and being aggressive. So just some things to know about how important this delight piece is.
We all come down to biology in the end, don't we?
Biology and relationships. It's all about biology and relationships.
Which takes us back to adverse childhood experience.
Exactly. Exactly. So these are first steps activities. These are just activities that I've developed. I always joke about it that you need to have a PhD to develop these activities, because that is so not true. They are so simple, really basic. But the key piece for me is that it's about the caregiver and the child doing the activity within relationships, so that it can't be a teaching activity and it can't be something that the parent has the child do. It has to be something that they're doing together. So these are just some examples. Cotton ball play would be something like putting a cotton ball on a table with a toddler and a mom, and having them blow the cotton ball. The mom can blow the cotton ball across the table. The toddler can catch it on the other end. They love it. I don't know that I have ever done that without the two of them enjoying it. Now, they may only enjoy it for a minute or two, but that's a minute or two of all those love chemicals and that delight, and I consider that a huge huge success. The egg hunt that I developed is just about putting little strips of paper in plastic Easter eggs, and then on the little strips of paper they say things like, give me a kiss, pick me up, and show my face in the mirror, play this little piggy on my toes. Again, knowing your own visit families, you figure out what those things can be. They have to be interactive. They have to be together. And then putting a few of the eggs out, having the child go get one, bring it to the parent. They open it up. They read what it is. They do the thing, that kind of thing. Sports announcer is during a period of time having the caregiver just say everything that the child is doing. And I have some information on cards that I give to parents about how these different things help to calm stress in children.
Some of you using Growing Great Kids will recognize that as play-by-play.
Yes, excellent. See, and that's the other thing, is look through those curriculums that you're using and find where are these interactive activities. They'll be in there, so find some of them. A lot of the curriculums will also have a lot of teaching activities or side-by-side activities, but find these that are really interactive, because that's the key.
Rolling a ball back and forth.
Rolling a ball back and forth. That's one of the ones that I use as well. So very, very, very simple things. So just remember the egg study. Calming the system can have long-term health benefits, so that's what we want to do with this.
So I'm going to talk about reflective capacity. And you can see the duck picture. And this mother duck lacks reflective capacity because although she can cross the sewer grate, she forgets that her babies are so small they fall between the cracks. I've used this before, and it tends to make people very anxious. There's a follow-up to this on YouTube. The babies were rescued. So you calm. But I just love this picture because I think it's a really good visual of reflective capacity in its most basic way. So when we talk about reflective functioning, it's really about the ability to take the child from a parent perspective, take the child's perspective. It's about the need, and it requires that we have the capacity to recognize our own emotions and mental states. And so many of the families that we work with who have had histories of adverse childhood experiences don't have necessarily have the capacity to recognize their own mental states, as sort of like my child is just trying to make me mad, as opposed to my child is probably tired, and that may be why she's whining. It's that ability to link those feelings that I have directly to behavior. So one for us or for me might be I'm irritable because I'm so behind in my paperwork. But it's actually that ability to link how I feel internally to what I look like on the outside. It's kind of like that lovely question that Alicia Lieberman encourages us to ask is, what does that behavior feel like on the inside? But obviously then that becomes a prerequisite for parenting. Because if I can't recognize my own mental state, and think of adolescence, or think of some of the families we work with who are developmentally in terms of kind of their social emotional skills, maybe in an adolescent level, I operate in pissed and not pissed, and there's not much nuancing in between. So again, it speaks to our need to address two generations, that if we can help a parent recognize their own mental states by empathizing with them, because we can't empathize with another, take the perspective of another, if we've never had that experience ourselves. So often that's one of the main strategies we use, is just empathizing with the parent. Now, of course, some parents can tolerate the feeling words, I like to call it the F word, more than others. So we find other ways to do it. Rather than saying, how did you feel about that? You might say, how was that? What was that like for you? But anyway, that's one of the things that we do for parents. And it's necessary, if we can't identify our own mental state or the mental state of our child, how are we going to be able to regulate? So it all ties together. So these are a couple of quotes that I just really love. This first one is Durie Paul. She uses this expression, being held in the mind of another. It's this idea that someone is thinking about me even when I'm not there. And you see this in a child who feels secure. Might be a baby sitting in their parent's lap, and they fall backwards and drop their head back so they can see their parent's face, because they know absolutely that the parent is there and they're not going to fall. It's the child who goes to step over a door through a doorway and puts his hand up to reach for the parent to stabilize them without looking back first, because they know with such certainty that the parent is there. And again, the second quote, this Arietta Slade, is just kind of tying this how reflective capacity links to our developing capacity for self-regulation. If I can't appreciate my own emotional experience, how am I going to regulate myself and therefore regulate my own child? So how do we build reflective capacity? I think many, many ways, but we're going to just talk briefly about taking multiple perspectives, validating the experience of both the parent and the child, and then again, this idea of being held in the mind of another. And I think, again, as Jane made the point, that the curriculums that many of us use, and I think these are two more of the common ones in Minnesota, the Nurse-Family Partnership and Growing Great Kids that's used by a variety of programs, but I'm particularly around healthy families, that these kinds of things are embedded in these curricula. It's just a matter of being finding them and being more intentional. Because again, this quote by Arietta Slade is that without an emotional understanding of the child, parenting skills are of little use and remain empty recipes that bear little relation to the child's internal experience and needs. So again, which is a part of why we, hopefully use in these curricula, these two in particular that I'm more familiar with, are very rich. They're wonderful resources, but we use them flexibly and responsibly, knowing that the sensitivity and this building capacity for reflective functioning is an underlying skill that can cut across almost anything that we do.
I also just want to say, though, that I love taking that quote in my mind and flipping it and have it be about the parent, about my understanding as the home visitor of the parent. What I think that speaks to in terms of the ACEs study is that by really hearing the ACEs study and seeing the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences that exist for so many people, that our emotional understanding of the parents that we work with will then translate to them being able to have an emotional understanding of the child. So I think it all kind of comes together.
Would that be parallel process, Jane?
It would be, actually, yes.
No, that's lovely. I mean, I think that's exactly what we're called to do here. So I think, the multiple perspectives, I think everyone's pretty familiar with that. But it's just this idea of asking the question, what's it like to be the parent when you're confronted with a really difficult situation, and maybe it involves no-shows, or what's the experience of the parent? What can I imagine the parent is going through that results in this, whatever the behavior is I'm experiencing? What's it like to be this child? Often that's the easier of those two questions to answer. It's easier, I think, for many of us that the child can evoke such empathy. Sometimes it's a little harder to take the parent's perspective when our protective urges get aroused for the child. But again, equally important in this is what's it like to be me? I mean, what is my internal state in this home visit? Why do I feel anxious in this home visit? Why do I dread this home visit? And answering those questions can provide us with some really important information and help guide our intervention.
I'm going through two and getting to the third one.
But
I can, never mind.
Okay, go, do it, do whatever. Oh, so Jane is prompting me to say, oftentimes when we talk about this stuff, we think, well, I'm not a therapist. And when we talk about, mental states and emotional and all of that, sometimes that can feel rather intimidating. But, we do therapeutic interventions all the time, whether we're therapists or not. I like to think, if you are dealing with you're walking through Target and there's a mom dealing with a child having a whomping tantrum, if all you do is, make eye contact and say, hang in there, it gets better, something like that, that is a therapeutic intervention. And you don't have to be a therapist to do it. It's the idea of how can I support this parent and child. And I think, so it's about staying in the present. So let's say a parent tells you about her own history of abuse. It isn't your job, assuming you're not a mental health professional, I mean, we all have different scope of practice. It's not about digging to China and saying, well, tell me about your abuse, tell me about your experience. You can say, I understand that would make it scary for you to set limits for your child. Let's figure out how we can work on that together. You want to know, I mean, it's so incredibly helpful to have that piece of information from a parent, but then we can stay in the present and our interventions are therapeutic, even though we're not a therapist. And it may be that you want to talk to a parent about seeing a therapist or whatever, but anyway,
do you want to go back to the others?
I just think the acknowledging the experience of the parent and the child. I think finding ways to talk in a way, using language in a way that can address or validate the experience of both the parent and the child. So you walk in and mom's crabby and the child is having a tantrum, or mom wants to unload with you about what a brat the child has been. You know, the child is listening to all of this, and you feel you can often feel like you're in a really hard spot. But finding ways to address both. It looks like everybody's having a hard day. It sounds like it's been a tough week. Or if, let's say a parent is talking to you about something that you don't feel a child should be hearing, saying things like, "Oh, you're looking kind of worried because mom's telling me about some scary stuff, but mom can still keep you safe." So you're wanting the child's experience to be validated. At the same time, you're not criticizing the mom. You're also validating the mom's experience, but hopefully triggering in her an awareness of what the child is experiencing at that time. So my parting message, I found this on Google Images. I loved it. I'm going to make one for my wall. Keep calm and reflect on.
That's awesome. So the last piece that we wanted to talk about in terms of strategies is building regulatory capacity in the caregiver and in the child. So what we want to do in our home visits is to support regulatory capacity. And as we said before, the first thing is to get yourself regulated, then the caregiver regulated, and then the child regulated. That's basically what needs to happen. The first slide I have here is about the stair steps to regulation, and this really has to do with how regulatory capacity is built developmentally from infancy to 5 and on. Basically that it starts with caregiver regulation, then the child starts to participate. You can picture this with a baby, with an infant. The child starts to participate and ask for and cling on and some of those kinds of things. Then it becomes dyadic, where the child is doing some of the regulating and the caregiver is doing some of the regulating. Then it becomes guided, where the child is doing the regulating and the caregiver is guiding them or helping them. Remember, take some deep breaths. You can sit here, honey. You know, those kinds of things, all the way to self-regulation. What I like about this stair-step piece is that those of us who are home visitors or work in early childhood classrooms often go to step 4, guided self-regulation, as the first thing we do. And for whether it's an adult who's struggling with regulation or a child who's struggling with regulation, remember that we often need to go back down the stairs and start at caregiver. So whoever is the caregiver at the time, if you're a teacher with a young child, regulating yourself, and then just expecting the child to participate, but you're doing most of the regulating, to a dyadic regulation, etc. So I like the stair steps because it reminds us not to always start with guided self-regulation and expect everybody to be there. People who have had a lot of adverse childhood experiences may not be able to just do guided self-regulation or self-regulation alone. These next 3 slides, I'm not really going to talk too much about them because our time is running out here, but I wanted to just say that Ann Garrity has written a book called Developmental Repair. She has a program where she works with children who are very dysregulated, very unregulated, have come from multiple adverse childhood experiences. And she does a really nice job of explaining why with arousal, that there's normal arousal, and why it is that children who have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives zoom off the end and are dysregulated. And as I do these slides, I also really think about parents as well. So the caregivers that we work with do exactly the same thing. Instead of going down from arousal when they get up dysregulated or upset, they go zooming off the end. And then the result of that is that the only way to get down to normal is dissociation. So again, Ann Garrity really talks well about this, so I would recommend that developmental repair manual that she
Jane, can I just stick in one thing I meant to say about reflection? Is
Sure.
I think we can't underestimate the power of the words, "I've been thinking about you," when we talk with families. I heard a story from a person who works in one of the domestic violence shelters in town about she was an advocate and having a disagreement or a conflict with one of the mothers in the group. And she just said, I think we're not making any headway. Let's come back to this tomorrow. And she thought about it. She was really upset about it and thought about it all the way home. And the next morning when she met again with the parent, she said, while I was driving home, I was thinking about our conversation. And this mom who was already, looking like she was getting ready for battle, stopped her and said, "You thought about me on the way home?" And the advocate said, "Well, yeah." And she said that complete demeanor of that mom changed, and the relationship was different from then on. But for this mother, it was a profound experience that somebody actually thought about her. So,
thank you. Yes. So just back to this arousal curve that in the developmental repair manual, what Ann Garrity talks about is the importance of coming back, managing emotional distress with company. And I think that's the key piece that I want to leave you here with as a home visitor, that both for the caregivers that you work with as well as for the caregivers to do it with the children, that the only way that people who've experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences can come back on the arousal curve and get back down to normal is with company. So we need to make sure that we are doing that within the context of relationship. I'll just flip through this slide, which gives just some specific ideas of what you can do with somebody who's really over-aroused. Again, from the developmental repair manual, just some very, very simple ideas about how to help regulate during those times. And one more very little simple thing, just to give simple strategies. Remember ACEs. The ACEs talk about how one of the ways that ACEs, the pathway that ACEs lead to health problems is through the physiological changes that we go through when we have trauma and extreme stress. And so regulating is going to be really important, and we need to address those bodily sensations. A very, very simple thing that I've learned, many of you may know this already, but with little kids, and this is something you can have caregivers and little kids do together, is to smell and cool the soup. Find out what their favorite soup is. Pretend that you're holding it in your cupped hands in front of you. Smell the soup, which obviously is the breathing in part. And then cool the soup, which is the blowing out part. And even my doing that right now, just once, I could feel my body change. It's those incredibly simple things. I know there are many things like that also in the curriculums that you're using, so find those ones that help with bodily sensations. So as we said earlier on, the ACE study asks us to do two things. One is to find the political will to protect children, which is like pushing a really heavy rock up a hill. But it provides even greater evidence that adverse childhood experiences cost our society, and we have to use these results to continuously make the case for a commitment of resources and passage of policies that help protect our children. That's one thing that we need to do with this ACE study. And the other is to build resilience, and we just wanted to give a bow to home visitors, because the value of home visiting in terms of building resilience in families and addressing adverse childhood experiences, just remember you're not only supporting families in terms of their emotional stress and their mental health, but you are actually addressing their physical health and longevity in the long term. So just a huge bow to all of you for all the work that you do.
Absolutely. And by the way, just a reminder that this webinar is can be downloaded. It will be available within a day on the website, which is the website is www.fallon, www.workingfam, WORKINGFAM.org/sign-up. So you can download the handout, you can download the PowerPoint and the audio of this. Somebody's asking if they could show it to their staff. Absolutely. You're more than welcome to. So thank you for your attention to this, and
Thank you very much.
thank you so much for the important work you do with families and children.